Okay, welcome to the Open Seating Final, for the avoidance of doubt, and for you to cheer for these people. Let's give a round of applause for the affirmative team, Sydney 2. It's applause, not stupid chance. And now give a round of applause for the negative team, Melbourne1. The topic for this debate is the riveting. The tax officers, officers is in like buildings, well not literally buildings, but not people. Officers, no R, should be allowed to retrospectively declare acts of aggressive accounting which exploit tax loopholes. Illegal. If you didn't get that, the debaters, I'm sure, have got their minds around this fascinating topic. A wonderful group of people. My name's Steve. With me are a number of illustrious judges. We've got a panel of 7, including Madeline, Carlo, Tasneem, Gemma, Philip, and Paul. Give a round of applause to these people. We'll be giving our thoughts throughout the debate, although thankfully not vocally. And we'll have the first speaker now for the affirmative team, Paul Carr.
Mr. Speaker, we don't think it came as a surprise to Starbucks, a multi-million-dollar company in the UK, that they should have been paying more than a few paltry $1,000s of tax. We don't think it was a surprise because we think they deliberately exploited loopholes in tax laws to avoid paying it. We think this is just such a case where the purpose of tax law is out of whack with the literal effect of that law, allowing companies to exploit loopholes and impoverish the state to avoid their true liability. The way we're going to fix that is we're going to allow the tax office to retrospectively declare this aggressive accounting to be illegal and to take that money by bringing a case to court. How are we going to do that? Under the status quo, we think that the law tries to preserve a relatively ambiguous distinction between evasion and avoidance. We think we're going to have a better test than that. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the purpose of the law, not the effect of the literal words on the page, and we're going to look at the intent of the actor to then avoid the purpose of that law. We would make an analogy to the way that we pierce the corporate veil to prevent shell companies being created by like fictional corporations to avoid directors' duties, to avoid tort liability by doing what James Hardy did and moving all their assets to a shell company so that the main company can just go bust when victims come asking for their payout. We're going to have this enforced by an independent tax office who's going to have to prove that intention to avoid the purpose of tax law in a court. 3 arguments from me. Firstly, why this is necessary. Secondly, why we think this tax avoidance is sufficiently bad. And thirdly, why we think the retrospectivity is just. So firstly, on to why we think this is necessary. We think that under the status quo, there is a huge asymmetry of legal advice between these cashed-up corporations and the states that they are defrauding. These states have private corporations have a profit motive, and like often profits in the millions and billions of dollars, which means that they have money to burn to spend on advice to make sure that they do not pay this tax. Turning now to what the state has the huge costs of surveying the way that tax is avoided across all of society, all those search and survey costs, that mean that when those search and survey costs are greater than the tax revenue that they might get, the government just gives up and doesn't look for those loopholes to close. Even if they find those loopholes and want to close them, the standard of advice that the government can afford is less than those corporations that are making millions and billions of dollars off those holes. Further, we'd say that private companies are getting advice that is specific to their legal situation, and that legal advice is then kept confidential, and it's very difficult for the tax office to recreate what they might be being told by their lawyers. Whereas the government has to pay to create tax law that applies in all situations across general society to all companies, and it's very hard to think of the specific ways that could be rorted by these companies. Secondly, in this argument, we say there's insufficient political will to fix these tax loopholes because people see that some corporations are paying it and think that enough tax is being collected on that to justify not closing those loopholes. And that's a problem. Secondly, because of lobbying, where we think that it's cheaper for many corporations to give a few $1 million to a political party, get their candidates elected, and then avoid paying millions or billions of dollars of tax. We think when you have an independent tax office enforcing those things, that's the kind of lobbying and influence that is not going to be allowed to happen under our model. Lastly, we'd say consumers shaming these companies is simply not enough to make them act up, because there might be insufficient competition between that actor for someone to go to a more ethical provider, and also because this system relies on the company's charity, and they're only going to give the minimum amount of tax to avoid being shamed by consumers. And they then use like the ambiguities of saying that they're a transnational company, and consumers can't really decide for themselves how much those people should be paying. That's why Starbucks, even though they've been shamed under the status quo, have been dragging their feet at paying their tax bill. Second argument I want to bring is about why this is sufficiently bad to justify the intervention. We think that there is a significant lag, that even when the government closes like the most egregious tax loopholes, for many years they are missing out on millions of dollars of tax. And there are some loopholes that they never close, that a few companies exploit and do it over a very long period of time, and that also adds up to a huge amount that's ripped off the state. Why is this bad? Firstly, because it decreases the amount of money for social welfare for the most vulnerable people in our society. When states can't afford, proper disability care for their most vulnerable citizens, it's because corporations have dodged their tax. The second reason it's sufficiently bad is it imposes costs on the companies that are following the purpose of the law and doing what they're supposed to. Because now there is a smaller tax base, because some companies are avoiding it and others are doing the right thing, we think this means that the tax rates are set at a level higher than they could be if we enforced the laws universally. The problem with that then is that the status quo rewards unproductive behaviours. It rewards going to your tax lawyer and accountant and finding out how to avoid paying tax, rather than the companies that create the most value in our economy and do the most productive and efficient things. We think that the real wealth creators need to be rewarded in this debate, and the way to do that is make sure that there are no tax loopholes and the tax rates reflect what companies should be paying, so that companies that do productive things are not punished. Lastly, in this argument, we say that our model fixes this, because there will be marginal cases where it's simply not worth the risk of companies avoiding tax anymore, because they know that they're going to be taken to court and that we're going to get it back. Even in the instance that there are some cases where the tax bill would be so high that they want to take a risk anyway, that the tax office never prosecutes them. Like the fact that the tax office could prosecute them and capture it means that we could get some of that money back. Lastly, we'd say that we don't think this is going to result in overreach in the government doing this too much, because it's an independent tax office, firstly, and secondly, we don't think states have an incentive to increase sovereign risk by preventing legitimate economic activity in their economies. Last argument, why we think this is just. First of all, we don't think that you really own private property without government recognition. That's why the government's allowed to take your property off you in the form of taxation to begin with. So if the government is allowed to increase the tax on you for your economic activity next year, we don't see why we should observe an artificial distinction between that and taking your private property, which you don't own, without them for what your economic activity was last year. Secondly, we would say it's just because these companies know that it's a loophole. They can see what the purpose of the tax law was. It's in the explanatory memorandum. It's in the second reading speech. We know that they've gone out of their way to avoid this, that they're not acting in good faith because they construct a solution around the problem that they find in the tax law, by creating shell companies, by hiding where the economic activity is happening, by paying lawyers to get out of this. We know that they're acting in bad faith. And we would make the analogy again to piercing the corporate veil, that when companies set up separate companies so that directors aren't liable for mismanagement, or aren't liable to pay torts claims to the victims of asbestos in the case of James Hardie, they know that moving all those assets to other companies is a way to dodge the effect of the law. That's why their bad faith justifies us punishing them for their intention to defraud the state. Lastly, we would say that retrospectivity is only bad when it's harming people that didn't understand the law or couldn't protect themselves. These are rich, well-resourced companies that could pay for advice to tell them what the purpose of the tax law was, as well as they could pay for advice to tell them how to get around it. We don't think that this is any personal injustice, because we're only taking property off them, not threatening their liberty. Mr. Chair, we think that these companies know they should be paying tax. We think they know they will pay tax under our model. We propose.
We'd now like to welcome the first speaker from Melbourne1, Melbourne.
Chair, I was never clear whether this was some sort of global scheme to cramp down on tax evasion around the world, or whether this was something limited to a specific country. But either way, the outcome of this model is going to be this. Either these corporations will move their way out of your legal jurisdiction to avoid the insane sovereign risk you have just placed on them, or companies around the world will experience a chilling effect which draws away from economic growth. But no matter what happens, you are stamping on the principled rights these corporations have to pursue and maximise their profits within the framework of the law as it stands. That is a principle we protect and stand for in this debate. What I'm going to be doing in my speech is explaining first and foremost why this model is principally unfair on a couple of levels. Then I'm going to explain specifically why certainty of law is important, but particularly in the framework of taxation law. And thirdly, the actual results they're going to get. They've said that corporations will keep paying them taxes and everything will be okay. I'm going to show you that's a load of crap. So firstly, a couple of points of rebuttal. Firstly, the distinction between evasion and avoidance. Secondly, the idea that the government is the weak actor in this particular equation. Thirdly, their point on political will. And fourthly, the idea of governments essentially missing out. So let's talk about the distinction they made between evasion and avoidance. And they tried to eliminate this distinction. It's a very simple distinction between the two. One is when you break the law or commit fraud to avoid the law as it stands. The other is when you use the law with whatever weaknesses may be built into it by your legislatures in order to maximise your profits legally. We think there is nothing wrong with that latter course. We think, in fact, corporations have a duty to do so because their duty to their shareholders, their duty to the corporations, the duty to the individuals who own shares in that corporation is to maximise their profit framework. They have no inherent duty to pay more tax to the government than the government requires them in the first instance. And I'll talk more about that later. Secondly, the idea of asymmetry of information. They have 2 points here. One, that the government, the American government, the IRS, can't afford good lawyers. And secondly, the corporations are really good at this and there's no search and survey costs. The example they gave here was twofold. Firstly, they said Starbucks is paying very little tax. Secondly, they said the government knows they can't get tax out of these people. It's a paltry amount of tax, so they don't go after them. If you think you're going after Starbucks, we think there's a great incentive to look at their books very closely, because the amounts we're talking about could be in the tens of millions or the hundreds of millions of dollars. Secondly, we think the government has the ability to require firms to declare all of their records, and no matter how large the corporation in question is, they are always going to be dwarfed by the discovery power, the legislative power, and the financial power of a government, of a country like the United States. We think that asymmetry of information and power just isn't there. And we're not just talking about Starbucks here. Every corporation and every individual out there is affected by this proposal. So we're not just going after Starbucks, we're going after corner shops, we're going after incorporated individuals, we're going after the 70% of the American economy that is run by small businesses. There is no asymmetry of power and information there. Thirdly, this idea of political will. That was just a complete lie, Madam Speaker. One of the few things the Republicans and the Democrats can actually agree on is the tax loopholes should be closed. Both sides agree the deficit should be reduced, but one of the few things they've agreed on is they should come together in a bipartisan way and close loopholes for corporations into the future. We don't think there's an absence of political will here. Lobbying can't overcome that sort of popular support, and it hasn't overcome that sort of popular support. And thirdly, this idea that we're missing out, that the state somehow deserves this money. I think this point will lead well into my principal material, but let me just put a few initial objections on the floor. First and foremost, we don't see why the state has an inherent right to funds that the law does not say and has not said that they should have. Secondly, we think these corporations are also providing great social benefits in and of themselves. Some of the great investors in these large companies are, for example, America's health system, America's social services, American individuals, American retirement funds, and construction firms around the world. We don't think that the civilization is missing out, essentially. We think they're benefiting greatly from the growth these corporations have provided to them and will continue to provide to them as long as you don't break the principle of unjustly imposing retrospective laws. So let's get on to my principal material first and foremost. Why is it unjust to impose this sort of retrospective law? We submit first and foremost the law should be prospective. It should be prospective for a few reasons. The first reason is that in the balance between state rights and individual and corporate rights, the balance can only shift the state with the consent of the population. So because the rights and all the jurisdiction of the government originate with individuals, originate with people, it is fundamentally unfair for state power to jump the gun of achieving some sort of support and some sort of mandate from the individuals themselves. We think that this is an example of particularly that case. We think, secondly, it also flies in the face of provisions that we've written into our constitutions and our civilisations from the start, like acquisition of property on just terms, wherein you only take away someone's property if you have provided them advance notice of legal requirement to do so, or they've broken a law. Not broken the ideas the government has to hold, but broken a specific law. Those instances where we do use retrospective legislation push the balance back the other way, from the state back to individuals. So we use retrospective legislation, for example, to limit state title to land and recognise native title, or we use it to, after the fact, give attention and state payouts to individuals who would otherwise missed out on them. But we can't use that same principle to apply the other way because of the analysis I just gave you. It also flies in the face of basic principles of contract and international law, wherein if you enter into an agreement with someone, and make no mistake, there is an agreement here between the government and its population. You cannot suddenly change the terms of that contract without the consent of the other person involved. And when the people involved here are the sum of the entire population that will be affected by the tax law, then principally you're on very, very shaky ground when the government decides after the fact that it got lazy and it decides to change the law back. But why is that certainty of the law actually particularly important when it comes to taxation, when it comes to financial services? We think first and foremost, the taxation law as it stands, being incredibly complicated, defines the entire scope and the reason that individuals go into business in the first place. Individuals make the choices and corporations make the choices to invest their resources based on projections over how much money they can get, what their return is likely to be, and what the risks involved in that particular situation are. For that reason, certainty of the law has always been particularly important because it informs those actions and allows those actions to take place. To make an analogy for a moment to criminal law, it would be incredibly unjust for individuals to go out and take an action that they thought would be completely legal and then the state to exercise coercive power in order to extract property from them. This is an exactly analogous situation. And we think in finance, when trusts, when airlines, when corporations design their entire structures around these particular taxation situations, it is entirely unjust to remove that particular protection because it removes their ability to protect themselves and deliver profits in the future. We also think it removes a state incentive to make sure those laws are as good as possible. Because if the law can be lazy, if the law can make mistakes, Florida, for example, just reformed their gambling laws and accidentally alienated and made illegal every electronic device in that state that can access the internet, for example. We think when states know they can get away with that after the fact by just going back and fixing the problem without paying any costs, without paying any suits to any of the people damaged and affected by that law, then there's consequences there. We think the state should just get the law right. We also don't think it should be the plaything of politicisation, where you can just decide that a corporation, for example, Boeing, is in the gun sights of the European Union, and you can go after them for things that were never wrong in the first place. It's a very dangerous tool. But what are the actual effects of this particular model? We think the first effect is the risk calculus of all these firms massively increasing. So if you can't escape from these new provisions, you have to cost into your structure the danger that no matter what you do, the government may eventually decide to take the sum of everything you've earned over the past decades and essentially put you out of business. When you're dealing with firms which may or may not have particularly high profit margins, that diminishes their ability to act. We saw this in 2008 when firms were no longer able to accurately price their risk, were scared of risk, and retracted from the market as a whole. You're going to cause that sort of recession. Let's not forget here that 60% of the construction in Southeast Asia is handled by structured investment, construction funds that use trust structures in order to minimise their taxable profit. You're essentially making illegal, after the fact, the very device that has powered Southeast Asia's economic development. After the fact. What does that mean? We're not just talking about people and numbers on a board anymore. We're not just talking about corporate icons. We're talking about the people who work at those firms. We're talking about the people who invest in those firms. We're talking about the economies that depend on those firms. I'm proud to stand up for their rights today. I'm proud to oppose.
We now welcome the second affirmative speaker, Nina.
about countries willingly having low corporate tax rates to attract companies. We're talking about countries that it had a democratic will to tax corporations for the benefits they got from the regulation of those firms. So those companies use their consistent resource advantage, their consistent profit incentive to consistently undermine those regulations to stay one step ahead of the people and the citizenry that deserve to receive something back from them. So I'm firstly going to deal with this concept of justice and what is right. And notice that I didn't call it retrospectivity, because retrospectivity itself is not the main arbiter of justice. Secondly, I'm going to talk about business certainty and whether or not this undermines a commercial environment. Then my own substantive is about how this creates social anxiety and resentment around taxation, which spreads throughout the economy, increasing the harms, even if it only applies to corporations. And secondly, how this exploits developing countries who have the least ability to monitor the legal strategies that multinational companies are using against them. So firstly, to the concept of justice. These guys wanted to say that this was just like breaking a contract. But the contract that the company had with the state was that it should reasonably be paying tax. So then, to the distinction between evasion and avoidance. We wanted to create a new distinction. We wanted to make the legal distinction align with the moral distinction. So why is it the most important moral distinction? It's because people knowingly used their advantage against the state to consistently undermine the obligations that they owed to it. It's because, and we can see that principle being applied in tort law, for example. So where, for example, a company has deliberately used shell firms to hide its liability in the cases of, say, poisoning water or damaging consumers, we don't simply resort to a blanket idea of retrospectivity when we know that the company was using the legal framework to its own advantage to undermine legal principles. The legal principle of retrospectivity was one thing, but the legal principle of doing what was right and what was owed to you and what you promised was another more important one in this debate. So that's why the duty to say shareholders was not one that was necessarily overweighed by the duty of the government where they had that regulatory framework and where they provided those benefits. Then they wanted to say that if it was about justice, then these companies could simply discover where these loopholes were. This damaged small businesses. No. This goes to why it was such an unjust policy. Because small businesses were always the ones that were screwed over. Small businesses were always the ones that could never afford the kind of regulation that you wanted. So it added another element of injustice. That was laws that applied unfairly across the political and business spectrum to those that couldn't afford to exploit it with expensive lawyers. That's why it was unfair. It was unfair because these companies didn't have the kind of specificity. So they deliberately designed legal strategies to apply to one large company and often applied strategies that only large firms could use. For example, creating massive shell companies and transferring profits overseas. Exactly what Starbucks did. That's why this policy was unfair in this particular circumstance. But then, they wanted to simply justify this unfairness by saying that companies had a benefit. It's like, well, yes, that's why we allow them to exist. That's why we have, that's why we regulate them and provide benefits for them and you know, all those kinds of things. But they also should be paying tax as one of their benefits, and that should be paid fairly across the companies. But most importantly to benefit, it reduced the benefit that companies gave to their societies because it encouraged investment in fancy lawyers instead of increasing profitability. These guys wanted to say, well, companies will shut down. Well, if you can't be profitable paying the level of tax that you're supposed to, then you probably shouldn't be investing. Secondly, the level of certainty. First of all, businesses are able to manage their level of certainty. So we don't think it's necessarily a problem. So if you wanted to be conservative in the level of tax you pay, then you'd be more conservative in the level of avoidance that you are undertaking. But equally more risky, you could attempt to be more likely to afford it. But importantly, that risk was on you. And that's what companies already do in the area of tort law. And it hasn't shut down their ability to function, and it hasn't damaged their ability to work. But importantly, we had this as an independent authority that wasn't going to necessarily just attack particular companies. But importantly, these guys wanted to say there was no reason why countries wouldn't just continually target these companies with no restrictions. But there is a natural incentive to stop. For example, that's why countries currently don't continuously raise the corporate tax rate, because it would damage the ability of those companies to exist in the first place. The fair thing about this, though, is that it's companies setting their corporate tax rates, the ones that can enforce it aren't the ones that are being damaged. And furthermore, this in fact leads to fairer tax rates, because the ability to enforce it fairly across the board means that that burden is spread across companies instead of the ones that are the most nasty and the most well-resourced. So on to my substantive material. This increases the social anxiety and resentment surrounding taxation. So the rage that we saw when Starbucks had been found to be only paying a few $1,000s of tax because they deliberately created a company, like hired a different management company and gave all of their profits overseas, was huge. That is particularly important because people see the tax man as always targeting them, so ordinary individuals earning money. The reason that is so damaging is because most tax collection depends on honesty. It depends on people feeling like tax is an obligation that they should pay. And that's why one of the most effective tax recollection mechanisms is simply to send a letter to people telling them that most of their neighbours pay tax. And that is why it's so important to maintain a fair system of tax. Because the problem of the negative team's case today is that when tax is perceived to be unfair, as it currently is when companies exploit loopholes, that loss flows throughout the economy. It flows through to all the kinds of forms of individual taxation which people are less likely to pay and less likely to pay for themselves. And importantly, in those cases, it is significant and it is at a large scale, but it is not profitable for the state to investigate each individual on that particular level. This kind of culture evasion, culture avoidance, contributes to massive losses across the economy. But it's not only good for the state, it's good for companies. Because the kind of rage that is generated against these companies often suggests the possibility of, well, if we can't close the loopholes, if they just keep finding new ones, the better thing to do is just to raise corporate tax rates and take those losses where they fall. The problem with that is if these guys were concerned about the small coffee shops, that's what it did. It didn't just target Starbucks and its ability to exploit legal systems, it targeted every single person unfairly in an attempt to recoup these losses. This was a more efficient system of gathering that tax, it was a fairer system, and it created a better mechanism of collecting tax across the economy. But secondly, this exploits developing countries who have the least ability to monitor the legal strategies that multinational companies employ against them. So this is the reason why developing countries have the least ability to do so is that these loopholes are constantly developing. So things like changes in technology, changes in new financial instruments, changes in the kinds of strategies that companies are avoiding mean it's impossible for countries to keep up. It's not a matter of laziness, it's a matter of constant change and ingenuity and the profit strategy behind them. So the problem that is when nations are developing their own domestic companies, it becomes harder for them to get back the resources that a particular elite is taking from their country and not giving back to the population that has educated, supported them, and largely remains in poverty. Ladies and gentlemen, this was a debate about companies using their financial advantage, using their position of power to exploit the people that supported them. We were proud to propose.
Now invite forward Steve D'Souza from Melbourne1.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's unfortunate for these pinkos over here that they didn't predict that we would support the rights of corporations to make as much money as possible. Because in this debate, if the information asymmetry was all wrong from the affirmative team. The government sets the rules and corporations play by them. And I only have to look to my own pillow talk to know that tax law is very complicated. It is difficult to understand, Mr. Speaker, and that's why corporations invest time and money understanding it. The idea that states where this will be implemented will raise tax rates in order to fund the uncertainty is bogus. In these jurisdictions, number one, corporations tax is extremely low. But number two, the top forms of revenue within these countries are from income tax and sales tax, which is exactly where this money is redistributed when we don't tax corporations. We get the money in the end, but even if we don't, we support corporations' rights to make money, to make profits. 3 points of rebuttal: the imperative for this debate, the principal justification, and the outcomes that they chose to ignore. So, the first imperative of this debate was that governments have terrible lawyers, so maybe they should employ Malleys or Allens or somebody else just to get some good advice. As I've already told you, they have the resources in order to do that from other forms of tax that this side of the House hasn't even mentioned yet. But more importantly, shift the budget, employ better lawyers, whatever. The important thing in this imperative is that they have a first mover advantage. They know the law before anybody else, and those loopholes can be only preempted by them. Mr. Speaker, please respond. Okay, second point of imperative that they brought us is that in the lag, when they're catching up on the mistakes that they themselves made when conceiving of the law, then we're missing out on tax. In the states we're talking about, some of them implement general anti-avoidance rules so that you can look at those companies and see were they in the principles of the purpose of the law, exactly in the way that they wanted to talk about, instead of the application of the law. So there is a regulation there. But even if that wasn't the case, if we lived in the libertarian utopia that we want to live on the negative team, we think the money just doesn't disappear into the ether when it's not taxed from those corporations. Where does it go? It goes to the income of the employees that work for that corporation, which they are able to fund, which we then tax. Or it goes into the consumption of CEOs when they buy their second or third or fourth Lamborghini, which we then tax. Or it goes into the trust funds of those particular directors, which we can also tax, Madam Speaker, or Mr. Speaker rather. So, in that debate, we are not missing out on any tax. We were happy to stand by the status quo. But then they brought us their last-ditch attempt to prove that something wrong was happening under the status quo, and this would result in artificially high tax. We think that the uncertainty that is produced by this particular proposal means it doesn't matter how much margin of the tax will increase, because we're losing on the productivity of a whole host of other sectors. They only wanted to whinge about Starbucks and Apple, which we think employ more people than the detriment of the tax avoidance. But even if those, no, not even if, but you didn't understand that those were the only players in this debate. What about the financial services that Daniel told you that cannot model as a result of this because they don't know what the tax principles will be? What about the services that rely on their margins? That mean most of their funds are invested in trust because they operate at the margins, like Boeing, like the Singapore investment fund that I'm reliably told operates at the margins. Those firms will shut down, Mr. Speaker, because they have no idea what the rules are going to be, and they could be punished at any moment by this communist state. So we were happy to stand by an artificially high tax that wasn't high in the first place. Okay, why is this principally fair? They told us, we told you, the law should be prospective in all ways possible, because people should know their rights at any given moment, and the state should not be able to take them away from you. Retroactive laws are only applied when the state has made a mistake. They said, in the last 10 years, we haven't been giving you rights that you've been entitled to. We need to compensate you. So when we see Native Title Acts, when we see compensation for workers, it's not about the state taking rights away from you that they thought they could be entitled to in the past. And we only allow the state to enact punishment on us because we consent to it through a democratic process, through regulations that we can monitor, not through the affirmative team's retroactive proposal. What did they say in response? They said, first of all, at Paul, the justification is, I can prospectively take away next year's money from you, so therefore I can probably retroactively take away last year's money from you. The point is that you knew the rules when you consented to have that money taken away from you next year, but you don't on your proposal because the state can invent it. So we think that that was not justified. The second legal principle was brought out at Nina, which was brought the House down. The legal principle of doing what was right. Well, the government defines what is right is, and therefore we think that under the status quo the government is doing the wrong thing. The final last-ditch example they brought in this area was that corporations were acting in bad faith. They were operating in jurisdictions that didn't allow the same sort of income tax regulations, and they were exploiting cross-border arbitrage. The fact that this debate was not set up as a global model meant that that was still an option for those particular companies. But more importantly, there are other laws that can regulate that, like Directors' Duty, like Corporations Act, which regulate the way that people exploit those particular loopholes. We don't think that the corporations acting in bad faith in this model fall through the loopholes of the status quo. I have one point in substantive, which is about democracy. So, we think, under the status quo, the power imbalance lies in the citizenry, not corporations. Why is that? Paul wanted to assert that in this debate, taxation officers are independent. He just said it as though it was carte blanche true because the first affirmative has the right to define the scope of the debate. That's absolutely not true under the status quo. We only have to look to California and the tax ceiling, which has impoverished that particular state in the US, to look at how politicizing tax policy ruins the productivity of some states. We think as a result of that, this particular policy is prone to exploitation. Why is that? It means that it empowers citizens to have an opinion about taxation policy that they necessarily don't understand. And the affirmative team sets up an atmosphere of sort of like hysteria, where the citizens are afraid of Apple or Starbucks taking away money that they're entitled to. We don't think that that is the case under the status quo, but citizens will feel that way as a result of these high-profile cases being dragged through the courts, telling them that corporations are actually taking money out of their pockets. Why is that a bad thing? We do not want citizens making decisions about tax because they don't understand how it works. The voters, obviously act in self-interest. Why is that? Because you want to have money in your pocket in the same way that corporations want to have money in theirs to spend. But the problem is, you don't have a macro-level view of the economy. You don't know what works best for the society. So individuals making decisions about what tax policy should be is necessarily a bad thing and politicizes the tax policy process. Mr. Speaker, the imperative of this debate was fallacious. It told us that corporations pursuing the rights to which they're entitled to, which is to make profits, which then they then put into our pockets so that we can spend, is something that is good, not bad. It increases productivity in the economy. But more importantly, every step along the way, we tax. The government is big enough. We don't want to see it get any bigger under this proposal. None of that deals with the fact that the advantage that the government has with the information asymmetry means that at any given moment it could prosecute any one of us for something we perceive to be right. That means we will not make any risky decisions. That means the economy will become unproductive and the government will be a tyrannical force to restrict our rights. We were happy to oppose.
Daniel Swain from Sydney too.
Mr. Speaker, much of the negative team's case in this debate is a generalised case for lower tax rates. They think that creates enterprise, and there are other ways for governments to collect money. The problem with that negative case is that governments and citizens have decided how they wanted to collect money. They didn't want to wait for it to trickle down. They didn't want it to come through consumption tax and income tax. They set a corporate tax rate. They set an obligation for those individuals to stand by. They deliberated on the basis of what that obligation would be. And we think the absurd universe where anyone could interpret that obligation as it's found in the legislation and the documents that explain it, as saying that you, a corporation owning millions, sometimes billions of dollars, owes thousands, is an absurdity that can't allow to continue. First of all, do we need this proposal? Second of all, what's the impact of this proposal? Finally, is this proposal just? Do we need this proposal? We said there are a number of ways that it's difficult, without this proposal, to recoup the tax money that is being stolen from the poor. They said that that's not true, because the government is richer than corporations. But the comparison in this debate is not the total budget of the IRS, legal budget of the IRS, and the legal budget of one corporation. It's the total legal budget of the IRS and the total legal budget of all corporations. Because they have to fight fires on 1,000 fronts, and they have to do it with their hands tied behind their backs. Because when Mallesons is advising a corporation that's retained them for 10 years, developing on the specific legal structure relevant to that particular corporation, the informational advantage they receive is so much better than the government that has fallen behind, that has only just discovered this behaviour because it was confidential. It was absurd for Steph to say that the information asymmetry went the other way, when the next sense she offered was that the government has clearly explained what its expectations were and what its intentions were. The government has provided that information. Your interpretation of it and your creative legal strategies are precisely what's secret from the government. But we also said there's a problem because these firms have such a huge incentive to engage in this evasion which isn't matched by a government employee. Because these are some of the cheapest profits you can make, Mr. Speaker. You don't have to create anything, you don't have to innovate anything, you just have to hire the snazziest law firm in town. That was a cost that's going to go beyond the government. Under our model, the huge payouts we generate would flow through that system and empower it overall. Steph conceded in her substantive material that the public don't understand tax law, which is precisely why the kind of democratic reforms the first speaker talked about, those arguments about that you need to make about raising taxes are difficult. And also we explained in our debate that lobbying power meant that there was incentive for politicians to ignore the need to change tax regulation. Their response to that was to assert that lobbying power wasn't as powerful as the political incentive. But Steph's material explained that the specificity of the tax code, the detailed and minutiae of regulations, isn't something that dominates public discourse, isn't something that's understood by the average voter. What is understood by political parties is a corporation will be willing to cut them a check for a few $1 million to save paying a few $1 billion. And that's precisely why we think the democratic intention of the law that voters voted on and the representatives signed into law isn't followed up into the future because we don't see the tightening that needs to occur. But that's also where the retrospective nature of this model came in, because at the time that you guys discovered it, it's too late. They've already made those billions of dollars at the expense of poor people in society and other firms. Which brings me on to the impact of this proposal. The opposition said, well, $1 you don't tax is $1 these governments can invest, which is true of all tax. All tax curbs enterprise and innovation to some extent. $1 that is spent on tax is $1 you can't invest. So the question of this debate then is how, when we look at the two fungible social benefits of tax and investment, we draw the line. Where that society decided how much $1 should be spent on tax and how many dollars should be spent on enterprise. And we thought that line was drawn in the purpose of this legislation that I'm going to explain later on. But we think that that's why they couldn't say there are other ways to collect tax or there are other benefits in this society, because that begs the question of understanding what the extent to which corporate tax was an obligation these individuals had. The second thing they said in this debate is some of these businesses will shut down. If your business model is dependent on defrauding the poor of the money they need to build hospitals in order to impose obligations on smaller firms who can't afford your legal budget to raise the corporate tax rate because you can get out of that, that is not a good business model. We shouldn't assume that the behaviour of firms is capitalist because they're firms. We think that just because you're acting in the private sector, you can act against capitalism, against the interests of a free and fair market, because you don't do what the capitalism was for, which is to generate enterprise, investment and innovation. All you do instead is take money that could be spent by the government to generate enterprise and innovation. They said that the problem of our proposal was it was going to be used maliciously by governments, but punitively by governments. We said that there were two things that would stop that. One, it's an independent tax office making this decision, not politicians that get a voting benefit from calling for that case. Second of all, they didn't get the money, the tax office didn't get the money by fiating that they now had the money. They had to prove that case before a court and win that particular legal case. But even if that weren't true, this telling the Steph's material on this relied on the strangely non-analogous example of direct voter initiatives in California. We weren't letting these stupid voters directly go after the firms. We were putting an enlightened observer in between them, the tax office employees, who'd make the decisions about which firms to go after. So we thought that was an absurd claim. The fourth thing was, you guys did not say whether this model was global or not. A Year 7 piece of rebuttal misplaced in Australs 75. I'll tell you guys, it's a global model. We'll move on. So, all the impact they wanted to talk about had to be weighed against the benefits we said of lowering the corporate tax rate for all firms and letting the benefits of that accrue to those that are enterprising and creative, not to those that are misleading and fraudulent. So we think in this debate then, let's move on to the question of justice. Was it unfair for us to impose a retrospective form of justice? They said in this debate, this is like breaking a contract. Well, contracts, as Nina explained, also contain an idea of good faith. That you negotiate that contract on good terms. That you weren't going into that contractual relationship, which, let's be honest, doesn't really exist in this debate because tax isn't a contract. But even if we accept this analogy, we think they're acting in bad faith. It's much more like a tort, which is where we create a legal system to go after the way that private people impose harms on other individuals within society. And we gave you the example of liability, which we thought was more analogous than contract law in this debate. And that's why it was difficult for the opposition to claim that we just don't know precisely how this is going to affect you. Because that's also true with innovation and liability. That you could think you're liable in a particular way. When that court case comes around, the prosecutors persuade the judge that liability needs to be reinterpreted, that the corporate shell you created needs to be pierced, and so you need to be defensive in that behaviour. And if in this debate, the affirmative can make corporations treat tax law the way they treat liability, that's a huge win for the affirmative. We think that's a sufficient level of caution to reach billions of dollars for the economy. So then what the opposition said was it's not fair because you are a small actor and the government is going after you and you don't have the sufficient legal resources. Well, we think that here the government is acting on behalf of the poor in society, on behalf of citizens. That we can't just say that because the state is acting, they're necessarily the most oppressive power, when these giant corporations have huge social influence as well. We thought this was fair because it was something that they could understand and interpret. There were documents that explained the purpose of these laws, and the lawyers they hired currently in order to interpret those laws could now interpret the purpose of the laws rather than how to get out of them. And that would be a much simpler and easier thing for firms to understand because they're written down in plain English and are much simpler than finding the legal strategies for your own firm. So even they could work out the extent to which that was a just outcome. But Steph conceded at various points in her speech there are some ways that, for example, in terms of directors' law and corporations law that she talked about, we push up ambiguous and broad obligations on firms, ask them to regulate and consider the risks of operating within that regulatory environment. And that's all we're doing here in this debate. The question in this debate was not whether corporation tax is what the people wanted. They'd signed those laws into existence. The question of this debate is whether what they wanted when they signed those laws is what they've got under the status quo. And we don't think that when they passed those laws, when individuals voted for them, what they wanted was for corporations to enrich themselves with fraudulent legal strategies we are proud to propose.
Now invite forward Tim Blair, please.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, the characterisation of the affirmative team in today's debate may make sense in a room full of pinko lefties who applaud every time they just say that these corporations are ripping everyone off. But in the context of an incredibly complicated tax system that exists throughout the world, we don't think they had a leg to stand on at all. We think the relationship between governments and between corporations that exist within that state is fundamentally different from between person to person. And all their analogies about contract and about tort and about good faith fundamentally don't fly. The rules of the game, realistically speaking, are that the government sets the laws and the corporations that exist within that sphere need to work within those laws. We think that creates the best outcomes for the firms within those societies. We think it means that governments have incentives to create better laws for taxation, and we think in the end that creates the better outcomes throughout society. 3 questions at the end of today's debate. Firstly, why is it principally unjust to retroactively take property from people and firms? Secondly, why is certainty of the law particularly important for tax law, given the actually quite detailed analysis we gave you on how these firms ran their operations and how they actually worked within the market? Third question, how will businesses respond to this? So first question, on why it's principally unjust to retroactively take property from people and firms. And Karp gave us a couple of reasons why this was supposedly fair at the very start of today's debate. He told us, well, we already do a heap of things in tax law, like we tax future profits, therefore this is perfectly legitimate. Missing the fact that this occurs in a system whereby they are able to operate according to rules which are written down, which can be ruled on by courts. We think that that is how this framework should occur, and regardless of whether you can do it into the future on future profits, we don't think that changes that principle at all. But then they said, well, we can see it in second reading speeches and things like that. So, that means that necessarily all these firms know about it and have a duty to rely on it. Firstly, those second reading speeches are not the law as it stands, and we think that the government needs strong incentives to create the best tax laws as possible, to ensure that those loopholes don't work. Do work, because in the types of world that these guys are living in, it's simply that there are people going offshore for avoiding things based on directors' duties, which we'd say we can already prosecute under corporations law. We think honestly in a lot of these types of circumstances it is genuinely just shit law that the government needs an incentive to reform. We are the only side in today's debate that actually provides that incentive. But then Nina said that the moral contract was that firms should reasonably be paying tax.
We don't think that's the nature of the contract between corporations and state at all, right? We think that the government have the ability to provide that framework that the firms must then operate in. That first mover advantage for the government to be able to set that agenda and to set what the law is means that it's fundamentally not analogous to the relationship between two individuals within a state, and that all their information on tort law and contract law didn't fly in today's debate, and that corporations shouldn't have to make up for legislative failures that the government have been unable to do themselves. But more importantly, we had reasons for that principle, right? We said that when you do create a legal system like that, you force firms to shut down. The information from analysis is what I'm looking for, from these guys throughout the whole debate was, well, you know, if you're a firm and you have to rely on tax loopholes, we don't think you should be in existence at all. They completely ignored all the material we gave you about why that was actually really problematic, because people rely on those firms, right? Because there are genuinely quite fair and just firms that operate based on what they see within the legislation, and that we thought it was more fair for courts and lawyers to make the decisions there rather than the state to retroactively come in and push that agenda. There need to be comparative between those two actors in order to win today's debate. But they continually analogised it to tort law, despite the fact that the nature of a contract between a corporate person and the state is fundamentally different to the burden between two persons. They told us that there was the duty of good faith implicit within all contracts. We think there are many investment vehicles that don't have that implied in them. We think there's no duty, like the number one duty when you're investing in a trust, for example, is to maximise profits. We'd say that the nature of corporate bodies is more analogous to that trust structure than to the contract structures that these guys tried to tell us. But then they told us, well, it's principally unfair because under the status quo it's unfair to a whole range of people throughout society. Firstly, they ignored the fact that corporate tax is genuinely minuscule in comparison to income tax, in comparison to sales tax. That is creating the supposed harms throughout society for other people. But then secondly, we think that there are benefits of firms being able to operate within that clear legislative framework, always knowing what the laws that exist are there and how they can operate within those laws. So actors like the Singaporean Construction Investment Body aren't purposefully malicious, right? They don't go, how can we screw over as many people as possible? They operate within a framework where they say, these are the laws that we have to work within, we will hire people, we will deliver profits based on those laws. We thought that was just. So second question, why is certainty of the law more important, particularly important for tax law? And we said firstly that firms fundamentally relied on the certainty of legislation and of lawyers who interpreted that and of courts who were able to interpret how that occurred, right? And we said firstly, firms base their business model on that. So the reason that we have this law is so that things can be applied evenly. We have the law as something which dictates how actors within society are able to operate within that society and how they're able to enter into transactions and things like that. We think that that needs to be done on as certain a basis as possible. You need to ensure that everything is as clear for those firms as possible. And here's the problem for the affirmative team in today's debate. Either this policy will be applied perfectly evenly and every firm that makes use of one of those loopholes will go out of business, which we think is incredibly problematic because there are firms that base their business model on that, which employ people, and we think it would be awful if those firms had to go out of business. And glibly saying, well, come on, they abuse the law, is simply not a good enough response to that. Or, secondly, you don't apply it evenly, which is the reason why we have these laws in the first place, right? So that you have a legislative framework and courts who can interpret that, who determine what the problem is, rather than bodies who look back on it from the future. We don't think that that's good enough. Then they said, well, this is unfair because of information asymmetry that exists currently. Firstly, we've given genuine analysis all down our bench about why we think the government has a decent incentive and a decent amount of resources to be able to determine these laws themselves, right? They may have to cover a lot of people, but the legislation that they continually need to look into is uniform, and they're able to apply those resources to that legislation in the first place. So that's our first response. But secondly, these guys ignored that the government also gets to set the rules of the game to begin with, right? We think that that means that information asymmetry is mitigated to a pretty large degree because of the government's first mover advantage and ability to dictate the terms of that. We thought that was problematic for the affirmative team. Final question, how will businesses respond to that? And firstly, as I've said before, we think the harm that the AF wanted to paint was vastly exaggerated. We don't think corporate tax is responsible for all the inequalities and the ability that we can't provide services to people that these guys wanted to point about. The whole room may applaud every time they say that we currently don't have sufficient infrastructure to give it to other people. This doesn't, this doesn't actually change that fundamentally. But then it was bizarre that Nina at the start of her speech conceded that incentives to incorporate elsewhere will still exist. And then in her substantive material went on to talk about Starbucks incorporating overseas. Those are all things which will still exist under the status quo. We think firms are just going to be willing to incorporate elsewhere where there's less uncertainty, where they're better able to understand the tax system. That's the reality of what's going to happen under their model. But then it swayed the characterisation of how this would occur was basically just that they pierced the corporate veil. If that's the fact, we can do that under the status quo. We're happy to use corporations legislation. But then they only want to talk about firms like Apple, etc. As we've told you, there are numerous firms that base their investment models on this. Those are the firms you screw over. Ladies and gentlemen, we recognise that this was unfair to firms who had already taken actions based on law that the government's made, and we recognise that it screwed over firms. This is an awful idea.
Okay, we now move to the leaders' replies. These are 4 minutes long, 1 clip of 3, 2 clips of 4. They continue, unfortunately, to be no POIs. We'll have Daniel Golder for one person.
Speaker, the affirmative team gave you a world where for literally decades companies like Starbucks and investment firms had gone out and paid very little tax to the government on an ongoing basis. They invested in long-term contracts, they had built up the economies that we all profited from, all the while the government and everyone knowing exactly what was going on. But now that we had derived their benefit, now that they had served their due, the government was going to be willing to just after the fact make up for their past mistakes, roll it back and seize those assets that had been legitimately and justly invested. That was principally wrong in this debate. This debate battled for 3 key issues. Firstly, what was the justice of the sort of scheme that was being proposed by the affirmative team? Secondly, what were the actual actions of the corporations and parties in this particular debate? And finally, what would the natural results of this model be? That first point of contention was an issue of justice. And you can note from the start the subtle distinction that divided these two sides. The affirmative team couched their language from the starting point of the government having a right to the finances, to these resources in the first instance. Corporations, in not paying them this particular money, were doing something wrong. Corporations were evading the government's rights, essentially, by following the law as it stood. The negative team showed you that was essentially stood up over on its head. That rights and duties originated with the people and were only vested in the government on a prospective basis. That rights followed from the people were not imposed on the people by the particular government. We showed you that corporations were essentially doing the duty that they had under the law to maximise their profits and do exactly what the government had written and told them to do. They tried to get around this by couching it with the vague ideas of tort law, the idea that we impose general duties all the time. But the fact was, in this particular case, we were dealing with a complex area of tax law that dealt with the assumption of property, but most importantly, we were dealing with the reactions and interactions between the state and individuals and private individuals, not with responsibilities between individuals themselves. On a principle basis, this proposal was preposterous. But we then moved on to their actual justification for this. What were corporations doing under the status quo? And the characterisation you got was this. Corporations are vested with a social duty. They are responsible to their society to pay not just the amount of tax that we tell them they should pay, not just the amount of tax we write on the paper they should pay, not just to operate within the rules as we write, but actually the rules as we think that they should have been if we had been focusing on those rules particularly carefully at the time. They count this in the idea that the current impetus was that we were costing the poor by allowing these companies to continue. The negative team called nonsense on that on a couple of levels. Firstly, we pointed out that under the status quo, the economy as a whole was benefiting greatly from the actions of these corporations. The investors in these corporations were things like social security, things like retirement funds, and things like ordinary individuals who were succeeding in their social duty in this particular state. We also denied the very impetus for this proposal in the first place. We weren't calling for lower taxes in general. We were just pointing out that their problem of corporate tax evasion was such a minuscule slice of the pie in terms of providing these services that turning the principles of justice on their head in order to solve it was out of whack with the particular situation that they gave us in this particular debate. But then we moved on to the important bit. It was the bit that we wanted to gloss over on the affirmative team, but it's also the most important. What would happen? The affirmative team characterised this and couched this in a way where corporations would look at these new laws and they would just simply adapt. They would cost it into their models, they would adapt and pay a responsible amount of tax rather than the tax they were told to pay. The negative team showed you that it wasn't just about how much tax they should pay, it wasn't just about how many dollars you took out of the corporation, It was about how many dollars you paralysed in terms of risk and uncertainty that prevented those funds from being utilised, corporatised, and developed in the first place. We showed you throughout our case that there were corporations that were dependent on understanding tax law so they could make certain investments, knowing what their future liabilities to the government were, without having to constantly look back over the potential costs. That was what was at the end of this day missed. That the basis of economic activity is the knowledge of what your future liabilities would be. It was the ability to invest knowing what those likely outcomes were. And to the extent they were happy to eliminate corporations that couldn't deal with that risk, they were talking about the bulk of the global economy.
To conclude the series, finally, we'll invite back Paul Cup.
Mr. Speaker, it's not pinko lefties that want companies to follow the purpose of the law, not the letter. It was voters. It was productive companies that didn't need to dodge tax. And it was small business who couldn't afford the advice to dodge it that were harmed under the status quo. Two issues. Firstly, is this just? And secondly, is it effective? On justice, we told you that we balance tax and enterprise. And once we've come to a decision, this debate is about where we've democratically decided that balance, and companies dodge tax by following the letter and not the purpose of the law. We said that the kind of enterprise that the negative wanted to champion was the enterprise of finding the best loophole rather than being the most productive and profitable company within that purpose. And that this harmed all other businesses in the economy that were too small to afford that advantage. We developed our material on justice by looking at directors' duties and tortious liability, but in these instances we look at the purpose, not the letter, or else our laws would be ineffective. The second and third negative speakers effectively conceded that these other ways to prevent following the spirit of the law were just, and we think that this was just our model was just a logical extension of applying that to tax money to stop companies defrauding the state, just as we stop them defrauding victims of torts. Their next response was to say, we'll get the money back through other taxes, which ignored Nina's material about how social resentment means people are less prepared to pay other taxes when companies get out of it. They said it would trickle down through CEOs buying Lamborghinis, ignoring the fact that these democracies voted for corporate tax, not trickle down. We justified retrospectivity in a few ways. We said that these companies knew what they were doing and they had a motive, that we had no need to protect them from a power differential because they were so well advised. We said that you have no right to your property without government recognition, so the government can take as much prospectively as they want, just as much retrospectively. And we accepted their, accepting but not conceding their spurious analogy to contract in this debate, that it was a contract of bad faith because they knew. Their only response to this was to say that it would be uncertain what the purpose of the law was, ignoring explanatory memorandum and second reading speeches that told you what it was, ignoring the fact that the tax lawyers that find these loopholes could be turned to determining that purpose of the law, and never, ever explaining why this was more complex for companies to determine than liability, those analogies we developed. Let's look secondly at the effect. They said you should just create better laws and close the loopholes. We told you why you couldn't do that, because the search costs were too high. The government had to provide law in general, not particular. That the total IRS budget wasn't equal to the legal budgets of these corporations. That lobbying sapped political will. That people didn't understand the extent to which these laws were being perverted. And at Nina's speech, that new strategies and technologies were constantly being developed. We told you our model would be effective because just like tortious liability, it will be cheaper to follow the law than to continue to avoid it. And if you continue to avoid it, we'll be able to prosecute you and get it back. And even if companies treated it as cautiously as they did tortious liability, that would be enough to get the government more money in this debate. Their other response was to say that this needed to be a global model. We said we would make it a global model, but that furthermore, that there's a risk of all regulation that companies could just go overseas, but that these countries had decided that issue in a democratic balance between tax and enterprise. At Nina, we told you that the third world countries are the ones that are most at risk because they are the ones that most couldn't afford tax laws that could just catch up to the increasingly innovative schemes of these companies. Then they told you that these companies would shut down, which we think was a concession that they would only shut down if they couldn't be profitable without dodging tax law. That conceded all of our material, that the real victims in this debate are the companies that are doing the right thing and following the purpose. It's the companies that are too small to pay to get out of it. At the end of this debate, what we can see is it's not pinko lefties that want the law followed, it's the people that put the law in for its purpose, not for it to be perverted. We propose.
Okay, please keep quiet for 1 second. 3 things to do. The first thing is to congratulate both teams. Thank you to that. The second thing to say is that lunch is being provided for the people in this room at this